Picture a world where video games have broken new ground because of high-fidelity graphics, realistic motion capture performances, and acting that would give most television shows a run for their money. If such a game were to sell millions of copies and receive widespread critical acclaim and viral attention from the gaming community, surely this should be treated with dignity and respect even from non-gamers. This is undoubtedly art, no? I detest this line of rhetoric. It reduces video games down to a medium where games are only an art form where they replicate aspects of TV and film to a degree that produces a kind of uncanny valley sensation where the graphics are so lifelike that our empathy responses fire on all cylinders because of the viscera we feel in response to it. I could care less if video games are art, but that doesn't mean I think the medium should exist without dignity. A singular, agreed upon definition for art doesn't exist, and while experts and critics may argue about certain rules and standards, it's been debated for hundreds of years with no unanimously agreed upon definition. I won't bore you with art history and language philosophy because if I did, we'd probably be here for like 9 hours. The definition of art is meaningless to me for one reason. It doesn't change how I consume and enjoy games that I play. And while it's enjoyable to see developers, voice actors, and other creatives win awards, none of that changes whether I had a memorable experience with something I played. I'm more interested in the practical consequences of defining games as art through the lens of big budgets, big awards, and flawless review scores and the implications that has for the medium at large. Art when discussed in conjunction with video games is often more like a status symbol in our culture than anything else. To have art is to have prestige. To have prestige means that a game transcended some bar of clunkiness and quality to be undeniable as a work of art. 2013 changed the gaming industry forever with the release of Naughty Dog's The Last of Us for the PlayStation 3. The game is a post-apocalyptic story about a world ravaged by a pandemic which has changed mankind from humans into cannibalistic infected, which are zombies that are controlled by the cordyceps fungus. To borrow a phrase from film communities, the game is often considered Oscar bait, a pejorative phrase to describe a project that was partially conceived to win a lot of awards. I think that at least in the context of when this game was created, calling a game bait for awards is a little disingenuous, even as someone who doesn't care for the second game's premise. The game had a lot of polish. It sported photorealistic graphics when it came to PS3 games, and at this point, some of the best games I could think of were like Killzone 2 and Tomb Raider. Naughty Dog produced something that was almost movie-like in clarity, especially for a title that is now 10 years old. The game was scored by award-winning composer Gustavo Santaolalla, and he created a soundtrack that I still listen to regularly to this day. It's memorable, emotional, and leveraged at the perfect moments to elicit a number of deep and deliberate emotions. The game was designed and crafted with care, with stellar voice acting, amazing writing, motion capture, graphics, soundtrack, and the experience of tying all of that together. I know that the game is probably somewhat overrated. It's released on every single generation of PlayStation for the last 3 generations, being on PS3, PS4, and PS5. But even I, someone you might think would hate it, actually loves this game. I loved Uncharted 2. I love the simplicity of the game and the execution of an action-adventure that is like an Indiana Jones movie. To me, Uncharted 2 feels like a 10, but so does The Last of Us. The Last of Us won pretty much every award that it could. It won 4 Game of the Year awards, numerous narrative, voice acting, and writing awards, and the game was a hit. Among critics, The Last of Us for the PS3 holds a score of 95, with most reviews putting the game at 10 out of 10. Do I think the game deserves this kind of reception? Based on my personal experiences, I'd say the game is a 10 out of 10 experience to me. I was a teenager when I played it, and I took a whole day off school to play it, and I got a bug that didn't allow me to save in the midst of playing it, so I got really annoyed, but I said, you know what? I'm gonna get some snacks, get a drink, and I'm gonna play through all of it in one sitting. I did that even though I had plans the next day. That's how enamored I was with the story and the gameplay. My opinion on the game, or anyone else's, is ultimately just that, a take on something. I don't expect you to agree that the game is worthy of praise because it won awards and got reviewed with a bunch of 10s. It is precisely because the game won so many awards and got so many 10s that we can begin to interrogate the prevailing art thesis for video games. I believe that it's good that people think that The Last of Us is overrated. Even as someone who likes the game, it's important to have diversity in opinion and allow the critique to take place fairly. Though I think that there's a mistaken belief amongst gamers and even some game critics that video games have to prove that they are art by clearing some bar that most games do not. I completely disagree. Arguing a definition for art is pretty much a fool's errand when it comes to how regular people consume it. And call it lazy or whatever, but I'm not fascinated by a perfect definition for art. We can likely agree on some basic terms like art is encompassing works regardless of quality, since having an arbitrary barrier to entry seems fairly obtuse to argue. But even this would be a contentious take on explaining what art is. To me, art can be good, bad, interesting, boring, and any number of descriptors, and I don't really have a clear idea of what elements have to qualify art. And I'm not going to argue through 600 years of debate to get to it. I think the reason that the art debate is even as prevalent as it is with video games is because of how different consequences related to how mainstream culture views video games. People who watch certain kinds of films and go to museums and such might be seen as cultured, but if you play video games in your spare time, you're seen as having a juvenile and meaningless hobby. I understand that aspect of wanting respect for the medium, but why do we care what one person or group of people think about video games, especially those that don't play them? Is it because they must go out of their way to engage with it? Or simply that they must not make light of our interests? Is The Last of Us suddenly worthless because film and art critics reject a need or desire to grapple with its storytelling, its gameplay, and the overall experience? This is the clearest example of conflating critical acclaim from the gaming industry and gaming community with games as art. People think The Last of Us is a work of art because it's considered a masterpiece within the medium. It's not art that is considered a masterpiece, a difference which is subtle but meaningful. This makes the definition of art so narrow to a point that most games don't qualify as artworks, whether it's because they're not refined enough or because they have flaws. Something that would be somewhat unconvincing given that you can't really argue that no art has flaws, then say that games must have no flaws to be art, as both are pretty firm assertions that aren't widely agreed upon. It's wrong to say that The Last of Us is art because of its perceived flawlessness, and the validation it's received from awards and reviews. You might think that I'm being a bit obtuse, but the games that people love are going to be fairly varied in terms of their budget, scope, and the genres they belong to. If video games are art, but only the most expensive to craft titles qualify, we're creating an extremely toxic rhetoric that undermines gaming as a medium rather than uplifting it. It's not uplifting to say, hey look, this is what games can be, when not every game that leaves a mark on people is going to be a blockbuster-esque story. Sometimes you just want to play something that has smooth mechanics and a lot of style, and other times you want that deeply harrowing emotional experience from a narrative-driven game. Regardless of whether a game has its flaws or quirks, nothing needs to be perfect to leave an impression on you.
Here comes the ice blast, ready for the dog!
Talk all you want, because those words will be your last!
The one who survives will inherit the title of boss. And the one who inherits the title of boss will face an existence of endless battle.
Half as long. Twice as bright. I gotta try. I know.
Accolades and review scores do involve meaningful areas of critique, such as storytelling, art style, direction, technical polish, but there's a tendency to misrepresent what reviews are in modern gaming discourse. It feels like in the last 9 years that a game getting a strong 7 or 7.5 is a death sentence, and that it's mid, but a 7 is above average for an experience, and that game might still leave you with an experience that you remember for the rest of your life. This tendency to worship review scores is so bad that people go out of their way to get aggravated by bad reviews on new releases that they enjoyed. For instance, when Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire came out, Twitter was seething over IGN's review of the game. Even though they unanimously disagreed with the opinion that the games deserve a 7.8 because there's too much water. I want to point out that another deduction was given that from a gameplay standpoint, there are too many HMs, which is not even that unpopular of an opinion. But people fixated specifically on the water comment to say, this is ridiculous. Whether the reviewer enjoyed traversing vast expanses of water or not is just a personal preference. And yeah, it represents the view of a major gaming publication, but if you read the review, it says that the remake failed to innovate or improve upon the things that they didn't enjoy. That's a perfectly valid criticism to have at the core of your review of the game. 7.8 is a good score, and I don't know why people are so obsessed with it being too low. The score is high enough that it definitely feels like someone who had fun with it would recommend it to others with those caveats. What's especially funny about this meme review is that it's become the de facto method of tossing out gaming criticism that disagrees with what someone believes is the general consensus on a game. The game has too many endings, 4 out of 10, IGN. This is entrenched by the fact that ORAS got a 7.8, but Sword and Shield, which a lot of people hated, got a 9.3. I'm not trying to be mean, but these games were reviewed by 2 different people. Bringing up the score disparity is pretty hysterical in my mind. As for the standards of reviewing, I can't really say much because I'm not doing a meta-analysis on their framework of reviews, and that requires so much effort compared to simply disagreeing with the score and moving on. If you only read Twitter at the time that Sword and Shield released, you'd probably think that playing the game gives you every single disease based on how bad the talk about the game was on social media. But I know plenty of younger people that enjoyed the game, and while it's not wrong to demand better performance and quality from a game that brings in this much money, to think that every positive review is paid shilling is kind of ignorant of the reality that most of the audience is supposed to be children. I want to be clear, that doesn't mean it's okay for a billion-dollar company to release a game that runs at 9 FPS and turns your Switch into a toaster oven. Just that with the concessions in mind, I can see why companies still give Sword and Shield a good score. I think that Pokemon reviews always elucidate just how toxic the culture around review scores and new games can be. People pay extremely close attention to publications putting up bad reviews on things that they like, and good reviews on things that they don't, and it really feeds into this toxic sort of pressure that the community exerts on publications to give things either good or bad scores based on what they think that they should be. In an article for the International Business Times, Ben Skipper notes that GameStop gave GTA 5 a 9 out of 10, something that was so egregious and unforgivable that gamers put up a petition to get the reviewer, Carolyn Petit, fired from her job. The odd thing is, she was a fan of the series since GTA 3, but she expressed that she didn't appreciate the portrayal of women in the game, which set the internet ablaze and hate mobs gathered their pitchforks. People that champion reviews as this important proof of artwork should absolutely accept that there are going to be detractors that critique aspects of a work that they feel fall short narratively or ideologically. Most of the review is about mechanics, presentation, and writing, all of which were commended heavily. But it seems that people weren't prepared for this new age style of reviewing where the narrative and political substance was actually critiqued and grappled with, not just looking at raw elements of the feel and the presentation of a game. According to former deputy editor of Eurogamer Ollie Welsh, in the 80s reviews were somewhat dry benchmarking processes that were detached from what the substance of a game was about. They mostly analysed things in terms of how they ran, and then looking at superficial elements like graphics and sound. Modern reviews have shifted away from merely benchmarking the technical aspects of games as they often grapple with the substance of the story now, to analyse and draw conclusions about the storytelling and both its strengths and weaknesses. This does include narrative and ideological failings like references to poorly written female characters, or inconsistent or poorly expressed political messaging. For all this talk about video games as art, there seems to be an outright resistance to the idea that media is critiqued seriously when it doesn't align with people's desire to hear about their favourite game in a light that fails to agree with their personal politics. For instance, even if you aren't critical of warfare and military intervention, there's really no way for you to avoid Spec Ops: The Line's underlying critique of military shooters such as Call of Duty and their romanticism of heroism and warfare. Which, let's be honest, it was right to criticize in 2012 since it's still relevant today. With GTA 5, I personally like the game, but you'd have to be kind of soft to think that a game which spends a lot of time parroting parts of society is exempt from criticism for the quality of its ideas. All in all, it's a good game, but if you think docking at one point isn't a fair critique, then you're firmly committed to the idea that a 10 is owed to a game, because its composition is irrefutably flawless and that GTA 5 has to be a 10. It bears repeating that everyone is different, and if someone feels that it has narrative shortcomings, they should be allowed to feel that way. Games industry and writing jobs are exceptionally volatile. I cannot imagine being so incensed over a review that gave something I liked a 9, inspiring a righteous crusade against someone's financial security. There are situations where applying your real-life socio-political framework doesn't really work for consuming the media. I'm sure that people have tried to reconcile their beliefs with a cartoon like Avatar or something, and it doesn't quite work because you're trying to impart morals to an audience of children, and that's going to be different than if you were writing for an audience over the age of 18. I don't think that this defense really applies here because the satirical style of GTA is social commentary, and if it's bad, it's anyone's right to say, yeah, this isn't that great, assuming they feel that way. Of course, there will be people that say, oh, you're just soft or a snowflake or something, but identifying so heavily with a piece of media that you're afraid to hear it criticized is truly softer than any of the people you're criticizing. All in all, the desire to be validated in your purchasing decisions should never guide you to harass somebody in this fashion. If we want gaming to be a medium that's taken seriously, we probably have to acknowledge that there's a vocal contingent of people whose self-worth is deeply tied to the validation they feel from the games that they choose to play. When a person hears that a reviewer thinks a game is a 7.5 when they feel like it's a 10, that person isn't hearing that the reviewer didn't click with the experience. That person is hearing that they're a 7.5 out of 10 person, and their very being is being attacked for the existence of such a review. What purpose does all of this serve? Seeking out random reviews that you clearly disagree with just to get mad about them. Reviews are not an open invitation to debate, it's just one person's professional opinion. It's not objectively right or wrong because it misaligns with the impact that the media left on you. People often take the righteousness angle and say no, it's about journalistic integrity and rigorous and consistent review standards, despite being motivated almost exclusively by the need for validation from a random publication that they don't even read semi-regularly. If that's mean to say, then I'm sorry, but it's a meaningless habit that so many gamers on social media have. Oh man, GameSpot gave it a 7.5 when every other company gave it a 10. They're trying to stand out. This is how dire modern gaming discourse has gotten. That review scores hold so much power over people to validate their purchasing decisions, and they behave so strangely when something challenges the experience that no slab of text can take away from them. I feel that the crux of the issue is that people identify so heavily with the games that they play, and games becoming art isn't the medium being paid its dues. It's more of this mythical title that will magically make your parents stop thinking the hobby is worthless. Something that will make your coworkers treat your hobby as something valuable and cultured as opposed to being a childish pastime that you never grew out of. Reviews are not the be-all end-all for any object of critique. IGN, PC Gamer, or GameSpot could call FF14 the worst game ever conceived, but it wouldn't take away anything that I got from it. It's not going to undermine the bonds I forged on that game as I played it, nor the heartfelt story I experienced. Review scores are just superficial in that sense. They can't tell you what makes or breaks a piece of media. The external response to review scores is one thing, but it's just as bad when it comes to promises made to developers internally. In 2010, Obsidian Entertainment developed Fallout New Vegas, a beloved entry in the Fallout franchise that many regard as the peak of the modern franchise. Bethesda promised to pay bonuses to Obsidian if they got a Metascore of 85, but sadly, the game got an 84, so the developer missed out on a paid incentive by 1, which really sucks for the developer's employees. With that in mind, I want to remind you that video game development is a professional field where people are expected to crunch, which is putting in a lot of overtime, which is often not compensated financially. In many countries, you do have to pay overtime for non-salaried workers, but it's not a surefire thing in game dev. So a lot of workers are not even going home to their families and friends and losing all of their sleep and receiving pretty much nothing in return if they don't meet these incentives. To consumers, scoring a 7 feels like a death sentence for a game these days, as people treat it as if anything below a 9 is basically worthless if they're only vaguely interested in something. Reviews are treated kind of like a buying guide. The closer to 10 something is, the more likely it's a good use of your money. It's kind of sickening that this 7 is bad mindset unironically extends to games publishing to legitimize such a toxic means of thinking about video games across the board. With the review score fixation being as prevalent as it is, we have to wonder what is the price of making art. Whether it's the expectations of audiences eagerly awaiting a game or a publisher trying to make that next big thing, review scores are worshipped as the be-all end-all for gaming now. If you're racking up 10s, then you indisputably have something worthwhile in the minds of gamers and publishers. The idea of something being worthwhile is the main problem with review scores and how they shape our internal bias. If something scores well, then you almost feel inclined to like something because it's popular to do that. I can't prove it with research, but I almost feel like people want to prove the things that they like are worthwhile to themselves, because people in their lives, whether it's co-workers, parents, friends, or family, think their hobby is stupid. And if the game gets nothing but great reviews, then they probably have a decent case to make to people who ordinarily don't like video games. There's no point in getting mad at one negative review about a game we like because there's no need to worship review scores the way that we do. When we hold review scores as this immutable measure of quality, we tell people that they're not allowed to think beyond the general consensus and have their own experiences. And in doing so, we prevent games from being taken as serious objects of critique that might actually be grappled with serious care, like film, television, literature, or classical forms of art. There's no deeper irony than worshipping review scores for art than actively engaging in activities that prevent fair reviews from being posted without hostile hate mobs spawning in response to them. How can you hold up games as art if you're genuinely afraid to see detractors critique something you like? Critics can have badly constructed opinions, despite their job description, but when people actually try to engage with the substance of something you like, I would say that they're being serious and fair with it, regardless of whether their comments end up being positive or negative. That's generally something we should commend and encourage even if we don't like or agree with the outcome. Many gamers want to pursue video games as art to challenge perceptions about the medium, to give it the dignity that they feel it deserves. Sometimes it feels like the art discussion isn't to enhance the ways we discuss games, but to find a panacea, a thing that will magically improve the societal perceptions of games as something valid and worthwhile to be interested in. This would be a noble goal if not for the ironic reality that there's fairly heavy bias against Japanese games that aren't from extremely popular series like Mario and Zelda. Japan's gaming market often gets reduced into nothingness, and for all the talk people have about treating games with respect as an art form, the exception seems to be with games from Japan. I am no video game historian, but this mindset around Japanese games was prolific when I was in high school. Only Western games had a level of polish because we had games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, Halo, and Gears, and emerging indie titles on Xbox Live Arcade mostly featured Western titles like Braid, Super Meat Boy, and Fez. This mindset ignores the litany of bad games released in the 7th generation, but that would make the narrative fall apart if detractors actually acknowledged that.
They're not regular grunts.
In 2012, at the Game Developers Conference, a Japanese person asked Phil Fish, who created the hit indie game Fez, what he thought of modern Japanese games, and he replied, "Your games just suck." He elaborated on his comments on Twitter by saying that at tonight's indie game, The Movie Q&A, some Japanese guy asked what we thought of modern Japanese games, and I said I thought they sucked. So I guess I'm some kind of big racist now. I'm sorry, Japanese guy, it was a bit rough, but your country's games are fucking terrible nowadays. If that made you upset, you'll be happy to know that his sentiment wasn't unpopular in the past. As a teenager, many voices in gaming would carelessly talk about Japanese RPGs and you're just sitting there like, they sure are calling this game unoriginal, weird, and wacky a bunch. This is kind of ironic because many would argue that a company like Ubisoft, for example, produces very unoriginal and uninspired aesthetics. And so does Activision with Call of Duty. While those are merely opinions on style, the very narrow and rigid view on Japanese games and Japanese aesthetics is particularly prevalent with the gaming community even today. I feel that many people dismiss Japanese games like JRPGs out of hand because some of them have things like fan service or bad or campy writing. Do Western games not also have plot contrivances, bad dialogue, and at times really unoriginal aesthetics? And more importantly, are games with those elements really worthless? Take Spec Ops: The Line for example. It's a Western game that leverages its extremely generic and cookie-cutter gameplay to tell an extremely compelling narrative that critiques the military shooter genre by taking you down a dark road that's born out of a desire to be a hero. You watch the protagonist go from self-righteous hero to straight-up war criminal as he descends further and further into madness in the searing desert heat. By the end of a deceptively simple and generic story, you've killed countless innocents, alongside countless Americans that were on your side, all because you wanted to be the hero. The gameplay is functional, but the weight of the game is in the presentation of its ideas through subtle details that are easy to miss before the big reveal at the end of the story. While it's nice when generic elements are subversive, there's nothing really wrong with having generic elements if they don't actively make the game worse. I've seen people rag on the visual aesthetic of Xenoblade Chronicles 3 for being too anime, even from fans of the very first game. But in my eyes, it's a very visually pleasing game that's not only stylized in a way that appears unique to other games, but it's suited to the hardware it was made for, which is the Nintendo Switch, which, as we know, doesn't always have the best graphical fidelity. With that in mind, I think the aesthetic choice is perfect. The whole discussion around what art styles are good doesn't have an objectively correct answer. But when I read about art style discussions concerning Japanese games, I feel like it's deeply unserious because photorealism isn't necessarily the best metric of whether a game has good graphics, and I'm tired of pretending that it is. Photorealism might be technically detailed in a literal sense, but we're using such an arbitrarily expensive bar to measure style with, when it might not actually do anything for the average person consuming the game. Do we critique art style by the function that it serves? Do we measure it by level of detail? There's so many questions you would have to answer, and even at the end of it all, sometimes the answer is just, I like how it looks, which you get a lot in the indie space. I don't think that anime styles are made to pander to nerds or any specific crowd, and sometimes it's just a preference of the game director. When discussing superficial elements of a game, whether something is good or bad is often a matter of taste, and sure, some opinions are more widely held than others, but that doesn't make those beliefs inherently true. Many people tout Persona 5 as the only Japanese RPG with a clear sense of identity because of its music, user interface, visual aesthetic, writing, and combat. And while I love Persona 5, this game has kind of become a cudgel for people who hate JRPGs to say that most of the genre is worthless, despite the success of the game being built on a celebration of what the medium has in store. Persona 5 did review quite well, and many people love it, but I'm tired of seeing it leveraged to rag on other JRPGs. There's nothing narrow-minded in the gaming space than using the celebration of one game to talk down about every other game surrounding it. But that's what you get with Persona 5 and JRPGs, and the same line of reasoning is applied to Undertale in the indie gaming space. A lot of people argue that Undertale is one of the only good indie games because of its storytelling, its music, and its unique combat which innovates on the boring turn-based combat that most RPGs use. I'm fairly unsympathetic to the belief that Undertale has one of the only good turn-based systems because it's unique compared to traditional systems, yes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's an innovation or that it's inherently better than the staple of just clicking through some menus. Sometimes the act of executing a skill in a turn-based game is somewhat boring because you're clicking through menus, but things like animations, visual effects, and battle quotes enhance them greatly.
Sworn enemies, you shall be defeated! Take that! Sky Dragon Slash!
If you can't see why that's appealing, that's fine, but you don't have to take the appeal of Undertale's combat to talk down about an entire genre of games. There's nothing crazier than being upset that art and film critics won't grapple with the games you like than having such an irrational and weird view of Japanese games. Oh man, you're upset that a critic didn't want to play your 20-hour-long blockbuster action-adventure game despite the deep impact it left on you? Imagine how people feel when they see you ragging on literally any Japanese game because you're under the impression that anything conceived in Japan is one note, filled with fan service, and a game exclusively for sexual deviance. That trashy games can be made in Japan is not a compelling argument to me, because that's also true of Western markets. If you open Steam for 1 minute in the new and trending section, you will see some insanely grotesque and offensive games that I can't even name without getting a guideline strike. I'm personally not that bothered by fan service or elements like that because honestly speaking, I'm kind of just numb to it all. And much like anything in life, you get to choose and define your own boundaries and tastes because we're all individuals. Nobody is forcing you to play those games with those elements, but it's ignorant to assume that every game from Japan incorporates those things that you're not comfortable with. I think we'd all be better off if we dropped our apprehension and suspended our disbelief so that we can enjoy games for what they are, as opposed to what we think they should be before even playing them. After the fact, sure, fire away your critiques, I actively encourage you to do that. But if we're to seriously treat video games with dignity, we should probably stop generalizing about Japanese games to the degree that we do. And that doesn't mean you have to self-flagellate and go play every Xenoblade and Kiseki game tomorrow, but just acknowledge that we might harbor some unfounded and biased opinions that pretty much hold no weight once challenged. Some people will fervently defend their position and say that it's because they have standards that they can't tolerate most Japanese games, but having standards, or the perception that you have them, is the exact idea I want to challenge by talking about games from Japan. Everyone has preferences, that's an immutable fact of living. We define what we enjoy, what we don't, our boundaries, and what we're willing to put up with. I want you to listen to this comment from Reddit that was posted 10 years ago when The Last of Us came out. Since finishing The Last of Us 2 weeks ago, I have not been able to get into any other game. Anytime I try a game, my thoughts just keep returning to The Last of Us. Nothing can compare. Fast action shooters feel like shit, story-driven games have lost their appeal. I was even saving Deus Ex from the PS Plus deal, but the game's radar and first-person view seem dated. Uncharted 3 was on the list as well, but the constant platforming, climbing puzzles, and unrealistic fighting have bored me to deleting it. The Last of Us needs some DLC ASAP so I can get my fix. This post exemplifies the problem I have with the games as art mindset. It's not explicitly stated that the original poster thinks that the game is art, but the luster for other games has worn off, and nothing seems enjoyable anymore. I won't be so presumptuous as to say that they are pretentious or that they're above other games, but I will say this hollow sense that nothing will ever be as good is what games that are touted as art in the gaming space often try to replicate. While it's everyone's right to become dissatisfied with games, I think this post personally resonated with me because I felt the same way 10 years ago. I felt like, man, this was the most heartfelt and well-crafted experience I've ever been through. Where I depart from such a perspective is that I don't mistake that everything the game does as a benchmark for what every other game should do. If you made a machine that exclusively makes gut-wrenching blockbuster-style games, then sure, it's probably gonna sell well, but it's not the only style of game that can or should exist. I am not so ignorant as to think that I'm above seeing and enjoying cool shit that doesn't fundamentally scar me or change my worldviews. Sometimes I enjoy playing something that just feels good to play on a mechanical level without the need for much else. It is within your rights to think that maybe every game should be a AAA blockbuster, but in my eyes, I've found that it's always better to have breadth in my tastes. I enjoy FPS games, I like action adventures, I love JRPGs, and I love playing puzzle games and MMOs. I'm not so narrow-minded as to think every good experience I have should be the same or similar. Sometimes part of the surprise is just going in expecting nothing and then enjoying things for what they are. Whether it's JRPGs, visual novels, or some experimental RPG Maker game you found a fan translation for on someone's blog, there's a breadth of creativity out there in the Japanese gaming landscape, and a lot of people dismiss it because of their biases. We cannot be serious in our belief that non-gamers should take games seriously, whether it's as art or not, if we kind of shrug off the narrow way we look at Japanese games. The things we often consider worthwhile are the sum of our experiences, but if we cut ourselves off from Japanese games before even giving them a try, are we not mirroring a similar level of ignorance from non-gamers? I could care less if you actually go out and play a game from Japan today or tomorrow after you hear what I said, but the mindset of generalizing about a whole subculture while being offended that it happens to yours is deeply ironic, and I think we should face that. In life, we're always going to grow and change, so maybe we can start by having less biased conversations about games, even if it's purely limited to our own small circles. At the start of this video, I said that I'm not terribly interested in defining the bounds of what art is, because it doesn't really elevate my experience with the games that I enjoy. And I realize that probably comes off as somewhat anti-intellectual, but I never said that it's wrong or bad to do that. How we make sense of our lives and the realities we live is going to be different from person to person. I don't go out of my way to pick apart literally everything that I like, and I know that doesn't sound believable since I make essays in my spare time, but I never try to pull at threads that I don't feel like I need to pull. I don't need to produce a 40-minute video about a game to know that I love it, and I don't need every good review and accolade in the world to prove that I was impacted by it, that it was a worthwhile experience. I don't know what art is, and I don't know what to tell you what to think it is. To me, I don't conceptualize my experiences in terms of whether I felt like it was art or whether I felt like it was worthy. I measure it by impact. Sometimes you can't articulate your words and feelings clearly, but there is some level of certainty and conviction inside that doesn't really need to be expressed in words. I don't mean to sound excessively corny, but that's how I feel about a lot of the media I consume. I might spend an entire lifetime trying to find the words to properly qualify and explain what it means to me, but I'm not doing it because I feel that it is art or because it has worth. I'm doing it because there's some kind of truth that I understand inside of me, that I was profoundly changed and positively impacted by something I took the time to experience. Maybe in the most general sense, art is anything and everything, and merely thinking about something as it were art is enough to qualify it as such. Why do we champion the legacy of The Last of Us as the bar to meet for quality? I know its cultural impact, and hell, the HBO show is doing a fantastic adaptation of the game, but we don't have to live in awe of games to think that they're worthwhile. What would you say to the people who love games with no story, that love narrative-heavy games with no voice acting, that some games are purely about their mechanics, the ones that win no awards, that review badly but still change you? We are the only ones who can decide for ourselves whether we think a game is worthwhile, but we really can't project those standards outwards onto others. I might not enjoy a game, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist, or that the creator's done something wrong by me. Their preferences might just be misaligned to my own. Even though The Last of Us is one of the winningest games of all time, I know plenty of people who think it's mid despite the technical qualities of the game, and I'm glad that they do. Our individuality and differences is what makes any medium diverse, from the creation of games to the critique of them. I'm not interested in combating specific points people make against video games as art because honestly, they're not that interesting to talk about considering how many people have made responses to them. When you're in Death Stranding and you experience a world rebuilt through cooperation with others that you'll never see, I'm not really sure what I would call that. It's pretty damn awesome, and the style of game is both original and compelling because Hideo Kojima is always fascinated by creating these high-concept experiences in gaming that pushes the medium further. But I don't think that such an experience is inherently superior to something that's like a faithful JRPG, that adheres to conventions of turn-based combat where your actions are based on speed stats or something like that. They are like neighbors in the same medium. The existence of one should not undermine the others. I think that making sense of games in terms of competition is this feeling that I've had trouble articulating for the entire video. Not everyone can win an award or become a critical darling, because that's just a really narrow means of contextualizing what a game is. Some are obsessed with things like genre subversion and immersing themselves in game concepts that have never been done before, while many others know how to appreciate where a lack of innovation is still executed with love and care to make a great experience. I've played games that my friends hated and I still enjoyed them, I like Life is Strange Season 1, and while I thought the ending was kinda whack, I really enjoyed playing it despite the jarring dialogue. Sometimes the only way to know if a game is gonna leave a mark on you is to play it. And if you can't, I've watched plenty of Let's Plays for games that I didn't have access to when I was growing up, so there's always that. The whole question of whether games are art or not seem to be fascinated with how other people see gaming as a medium, chasing after validation from parties that have no interest in budging from their opinions. I won't say that it's wrong or pretentious to act that way because I personally don't agonize over the nature of something I enjoy with reference to how other people see it. For the most part, I feel like the impact of such an opinion is harmless to me. If there's any area of inquiry that's worthwhile when treating video games as art, it's probably video games preservation, where the main blockade isn't critics, but copyright holders blocking any meaningful attempts to preserve video games for future generations to enjoy and current academics to study. At the end of the day, I know what kind of games I like playing, whether I can express that in words or not. I do not have to coronate every piece of media with the crown of art to know that I enjoyed something, because there's no fundamental benefit in doing so. While I want the games I enjoy to be treated with respect, I only want that in the sense of a generalized attitude towards gaming. Not because having a load of awards, good reviews, and the broader popular culture on my side is enough to exert pressure on critics to concede the point, as opposed to just saying that it's cool that games exist, I guess. Making games art, to me, is not an exercise in instilling tens of millions of people with awe. If we set such a high bar, the majority of things that have meant a lot to us in our formative years probably don't even count. Gaming as a medium would not count. Making games art is about as simple as feeling anything at all, even boredom. Maybe that too is just another controversial addition to a debate that's been raging for several hundred years. If it means a lot to you, then it's gotta count for something regardless of what anyone says. Even me. I spend a lot of time criticizing the ways that people construct video games as art because it almost dulls people's taste in video games by being too dismissive of too many games in the medium. There's no requirement that you play a little bit of everything, but there's no need for that to influence comments that diminish the value of games that you don't understand or engage with. When video games aren't treated as art on an interpersonal level, it's just dismissive of your hobbies, which is kind of inane in a vacuum. When video games are dismissed as meaningful in society or being culturally relevant, then there are no paid grants that help support the development of small and medium-sized projects for video games. There are fewer publications willing to help spread the word of your project, and ultimately, we may be robbed of a work that could have changed the lives of many people who experienced it. I sometimes wonder about the dismissiveness of critics with video games and their refusal to believe that games could ever become worthwhile as art forms, even without achieving some Herculean feat like becoming an interactive epic. Are the professional opinions of these filmmakers and critics creating self-fulfilling prophecies where games can never be art because people start to agree with them? The question's still up in the air, even now. My timeline is obviously not objective, nor is it perfect. It was personal to my experiences going through high school in the last generation of gaming. Structuring my thoughts and even coming to a conclusion on what I think art is were kind of secondary to expressing my frustration with the distractions that exist in this space. The gaming space has a lot of issues, and the prevalence of those issues contribute to a difficulty in discussing games in a critical context. because we're so bogged down by meaningless metrics of quality as if they were immutable facts. Something can be flawed, rough around the edges, or even completely fail to do what it sets out to and still mean a lot to people. I don't think that we need to prove that something has the right to exist. Much in the same way, we don't really need to prove our own existence or why we live the way that we do. If it made one person feel something, then shit, maybe that's enough. In the same way, even if no one agrees or cares about what I said, at least people who watch my videos gave their time up to listen to what I had to say. Now the ball is in your court. What do you think video games as art means? Because my answer does not seek to exclude things with review scores and accolades. I think that games can mean anything to anyone, so I don't really need to present a rigid definition to make sense of the thing that I enjoyed. Even after all this talking, we're not any closer to settling the debate of what art is, or if video games are even art. All I know is that I don't have to present my interests as the best possible thing to know that it means a lot to me. Besides, it's not like the widespread critical acclaim of an IP will result in the complete abandonment of original ideas and new IPs, right?